Everything you learned in public school about Shakespeare is wrong, and Shakespeare is fun. Yes, I said it. You ready to find out why? Hi, I'm Jenny with Kids Learning for Life, and I have had so much success with doing Shakespeare plays with my kids that I wanted to share with you some tips that have helped us and might help you also. If you're watching this video, you're probably wishing that you had a better education in Shakespeare. The way that Shakespeare is taught in public schools is tedious at best and infuriating at worst. While Shakespeare is still left in many public schools as a high school standard that needs to be met, the way that it's taught tends to leave more people with hostility towards the bard instead of admiration. But there are ways that you can teach Shakespeare to your kids that will instill a sense of fun and wonder that will hopefully last for their entire lifetimes. First, it's almost never too early to start Shakespeare. My second daughter is 6, and she's probably the biggest Shakespeare fan in our house. I think that some people have this misconception that you have to start Shakespeare later on when your kids are teenagers, but I really don't think it benefits anyone to wait that long. You want to expose your kids to the language and the plots of Shakespeare early so that they don't feel so foreign later on. But if your kids are teenagers already and you want to start doing plays with them, better late than never. Some good plays to start with are The Tempest, Twelfth Night, and As You Like It. These are all pretty light and relatively easy to follow as far as Shakespeare goes. My kids also enjoyed Richard II, which is a personal favorite of mine, and it's actually one of Shakespeare's history plays, so don't be afraid to play around with the genres and maybe go a little bit outside of your comfort zone. Second, instead of reading the actual plays with and to your kids, you might want to just start with some retellings of the plays. This is a great option for younger children, but also if you as the parent are still a little uncomfortable with the language of Shakespeare, this is a great way to dip your toe in. The book of retellings that I use is called Tales from Shakespeare by Charles and Mary Lamb, but there is also a really good equivalent called Beautiful Stories from Shakespeare by Edith Nesbit. Between the two, they have the majority of Shakespeare's plays in shortened form and more like reading a story so that it's easier to understand. I really like the way that Tales from Shakespeare has big chunks of the original Shakespearean language in it so that we don't miss out on that when we're just doing a retelling first. Third, watch the plays with your kids. There's a bit of a debate in the classical education movement about whether or not Shakespeare should primarily be read or watched. While I appreciate Shakespeare's written works as beautiful, wonderful pieces of poetry, I do feel like ultimately he wrote these plays to be performed and watched by an audience, so I do kind of lean towards primarily watching the plays with your kids. We have a Marquee TV subscription, which is a streaming app and site that's about $9 a month, I want to say, and it gives you access to a lot of different Shakespeare plays, in particular by the Royal Shakespeare Company and the Globe Theatre, which are really high quality versions of these plays. In addition to Shakespeare, Marquee TV also has things like ballets and operas, if that adds extra value to your family. You can also sometimes find some good versions of Shakespeare plays done by colleges or random, community theater groups on YouTube. You may want to screen any Shakespeare plays that you plan on watching with your kids alone by yourself first, because there's a lot of things in Shakespeare that typically go over young children's heads, but depending on the performance and how it is staged and portrayed, you never know what kinds of things might be insinuated. Some really great versions of the plays that we've watched recently together are The Winter's Tale by the Royal Shakespeare Company. This one is starring Simon Russell Beale. And we also really loved As You Like It by the Globe Theatre. I believe it came out sometime in the early 2000s, maybe about 15 or 20 years ago. Those are two that are family friendly and really well done, in my opinion. I also want to share some resources when you're getting started learning about Shakespeare that will help your kids and you. Podcasts. The #1 Shakespeare podcast that I recommend to everyone is Chop Bard. The host, Aaron Ziegler, breaks down Shakespeare plays one scene at a time, so it really kind of gets rid of any confusion you might have while you're following along with these plays. And regardless if you're confused or not, the podcast is really entertaining, and I just love Aaron Ziegler's podcast style. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's a family podcast. I would definitely suggest listening to episodes before you listen to them together, but for the most part, they are appropriate, and it's a great resource, and it's one of my kids' favorite podcasts. I wanted to share this Shakespeare alphabet book that Aaron and his partner Shannon created together, and his mom actually illustrated it. And it's so cute. It has like a different Shakespeare character or element per letter of the alphabet. And this is actually a personal favorite book of my kids. I'll make sure to link to a copy below. For young visual learners, Usborne has a series of picture books that are retellings of Shakespeare plays. After seeing how much my kids loved Hamlet and they loved the Lamb's retelling of it in Tales from Shakespeare, I actually got my kids this from our local used bookstore. So this is just a picture book version of Hamlet, and this has quickly become another one of my kids' favorite picture books that we have on our shelves. One note about these is that I would not suggest giving these to your kids as an introduction or as their only form of Shakespeare in your homeschool. You definitely want to be exposed to the actual plays first. There are also many books out there that analyze Shakespeare's works, but I would recommend these more for the parent and less for the children because they are a little bit long, a little bit dry, and kind of inside baseball. Kids should definitely just be exposed to Shakespeare and kind of take from it what they will. But if you want to go deeper into your Shakespeare education, then I suggest The Meaning of Shakespeare, Parts 1 and 2 by Harold Goddard. This is my copy of Volume 2. I also have Volume 1, and they're really accessible. They're short, and he kind of talks a little bit about each play and kind of what the different themes are, what the characters' roles are. I don't know. I like this kind of stuff, so highly recommend. They're really accessible. If you want something a little bit more extensive, you can always check out Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare. And yes, that is by Isaac Asimov, who is a famous science fiction writer. I'm not even gonna pick up the book because it's massive and I'm afraid that I'm gonna like rip the book jacket, but this is it. It is absolutely monstrous, and I haven't actually read too much of it yet, but it seems to be a really well-known and well-used resource by a lot of Shakespearean scholars, and I'm really interested to see what Asimov has to say about Shakespeare. I'm fascinated by this concept that he wrote this massive book about Shakespeare. He was clearly a fan. These are all just great supplemental guides to Shakespeare, and while they're not completely necessary, I do think that it's great to dive deeper into Shakespeare and give yourself that classic education that you never had. And that brings me to my last point. Learn Shakespeare alongside your kids. I grew up doing theater, I grew up doing Shakespeare, and my mom always would take me to Shakespeare in the Park when it was available in our community. So it's safe to say that Shakespeare is not outside of my comfort zone. But even I don't have experience with every single Shakespeare play. So going into teaching it to my kids, there are some plays that I had zero knowledge or experience with. Well, I ended up having just as much fun as my kids learning about these plays, and it was kind of like we were exploring a new topic or like even a whole new school subject together as a family. And when teaching Shakespeare, your goal should be just to make it fun. Have your kids act out certain scenes for you. Maybe ask them to like draw illustrations or pictures from certain scenes in the play, whatever stood out to them. I've heard of these paper dolls being available online. They're even on Amazon, so I'll try to find them and link them below, that you can kind of act out the plays with, and then, it helps you learn the plot and memorize the plot, but also help keep the different characters straight. As long as kids are introduced to Shakespeare in a positive light, then they will delight in the worlds that he has created. I want to share just one small example from my own homeschool that might give you some encouragement. So my second daughter, who is 6.5, she's always a little bit more reluctant to narrate the Shakespeare plays that we have done. Now, if you're not aware, narration is kind of retelling what you have just heard or seen or experienced to someone else. So she's always been a little bit of a reluctant narrator, and so I wasn't really sure what she was getting from different plays. So after we read the retelling of Hamlet, I actually asked her, hey, can you just draw a picture of one of the scenes from this play so that, you can share it with us? And she not only did one picture, she made like an entire book, and it had all of the really famous scenes from from Hamlet. There was Ophelia with the flowers, there was like the sword with the poison drop on it. Like, she went into so much detail, and for me, that really showed me how much she's getting from these plays and how much she is enjoying it. Linked over here will be the podcast that we did with Chop Bard host Aaron Ziegler on how he thinks families should do Shakespeare together. He has a wealth of knowledge in this area, and he's also just like the nicest guy ever. So definitely check that out. He just shares so much good information in that episode. See you next time, and happy homeschooling.